2. 3 million patient records. 1 root password. 0 people in the building who knew it. And my phone was ringing. It was 2:14 in the morning on a Tuesday in January, and I was sitting in my home office in Portland in a flannel robe that had seen better decades, eating cereal over my keyboard because I couldn't sleep, and I was halfway through reinstalling a personal NAS drive just for something to do with my hands. The snow outside was doing what Portland snow does, committing to nothing, hovering, suggesting the possibility of accumulation without ever quite following through. My cat, whose name is Pseudo, because I made him up and have to live with that, was sitting on my networking textbook and purring with the self-satisfaction of someone who has never once been responsible for a production environment. My phone screen lit up. Unknown number. Portland area code. I knew what it was before I answered. I think I'd known for 3 weeks, since the afternoon Mitchell Park, 33 years old, 7 months into his tenure as Chief Technology Officer of Harrow Health Systems, told me that my position was being eliminated in alignment with a strategic organizational realignment, which is corporate for, "We're firing you and we've practiced saying it so we don't have to feel bad about it." I'd known, on some level, that the call was coming. I'd known the way you know a storm is coming when you can smell it in the air and you've checked the pressure and you've read the forecast and you've been telling everyone to board up their windows for 14 months and everyone has smiled politely and gone back to talking about velocity. I answered the phone. Sophie. It was Dr. Elena Vasquez, not IT, not the help desk, not some on-call contractor who'd found my number in a deprecated spreadsheet. The chief medical officer herself, at 2 a.m., and her voice had the particular quality of someone who has been awake for hours and has made several decisions they can never unmake. "Sophie, I need to tell you something before I ask you anything." "Okay," I said. "My daughter is in the oncology system. She's been a patient for 8 months. A pause. I'm telling you that so you know I'm not calling you as an executive. I'm calling you as a mother." And there it was, the thing that made it impossible to just say no and go back to my cereal. But we'll get to that. Let me back up 3 weeks, because the 2 a.m. call doesn't make any sense without the context. And the context is a beautiful, infuriating, almost comedically perfect example of how large institutions destroy themselves from the inside. Slowly. Methodically, with PowerPoint slides. I joined Harrow Health Systems 19 years ago as a junior network engineer. They were a mid-size healthcare technology company. Think of them as the infrastructure layer between hospitals and their data, the company whose software sits in the background while your doctor pulls up your medication history on a screen that always seems to be running Windows 7 for some reason. They processed records, managed insurance communications, handled the back end for a network of regional hospitals and outpatient clinics across the Pacific Northwest. When I started, their security infrastructure was what I generously described to my husband at the time as a house cat guarding a bank vault. There was a perimeter firewall that hadn't been patched since the Clinton administration, access controls that were basically just vibes, and an encryption implementation that I am legally forbidden from describing in more detail because it would constitute a roadmap. I spent 19 years fixing it. That's not an exaggeration. I mean, I built the thing, the whole stack, the credential management system, the encryption architecture, the incident response protocols, the audit logging framework, the HIPAA compliance scaffolding, all of it. I did it across 4 CEOs, 2 major acquisitions, 1 catastrophic hardware failure that I will take to my grave, and approximately 8,000 meetings where someone asked me to explain what a VPN was. I became a senior systems architect, which is a title that means the person who knows where all the bodies are buried, and also why the bodies are there, and also she put most of them there herself, and also she probably built the shovel. I was good at my job. I'm not being coy about that. I was very good at my job, and I knew it, and the people who mattered knew it, and the people who didn't matter. Well, Mitchell Park arrived in May. He came from a social media company. I will not name the social media company because I don't want to be sued, but I will tell you that it was the kind of social media company whose primary contribution to society has been giving your uncle a megaphone. He was 33, which is not a disqualifier. I was doing serious work at 33. But he was 33 in the specific way that happens when someone is talented in one domain, gets promoted very quickly, and never develops the second skill that tells them where their domain ends and someone else's begins. His first week, he called a town hall for the entire IT department. He put up a slide that said, Harrow Health, built for yesterday, designed for today, ready for tomorrow, which was grammatically nonsensical in a way that still bothers me. And he talked for 40 minutes about velocity and architectural agility and cloud-native transformation and the legacy debt that was holding the organization back from its potential. He said disruptive without irony 4 times. I counted. I had a spreadsheet. I raised my hand during Q&A and asked him what his background was in HIPAA technical safeguards. He said healthcare IT was fundamentally the same as any other vertical, just with more compliance overhead. He said overhead the way you say speed bump, like it was an annoyance rather than the entire reason our systems couldn't just be a startup's AWS account with some good vibes and a Slack integration. I wrote a memo that night. I documented the exchange, timestamped it, filed it in the folder I called, with what I now recognize as prophetic accuracy, the Mitchell Archive. The Mitchell Archive would grow to 47 documents over the next 7 months. Let me tell you about some of them. In June, Mitchell proposed migrating our credential management system to a third-party SaaS solution. The credential management system he wanted to replace was the one I had built, and it was specifically architected to meet the technical safeguards requirements of HIPAA's security rule: isolated network segment, air-gapped vault for the highest privilege credentials, audit logging that met the 6-year retention requirement, the whole thing. I sent him a 14-page technical brief explaining why the proposed SaaS solution did not meet regulatory requirements and would expose the company to a minimum of $1.2 million in per-violation fines. He replied, "Thanks for this. We'll loop in legal." Legal never called me. In August, Mitchell's team, which was starting to look a lot like people he'd brought over from the social media company, people who were excellent at what they did, which was not healthcare IT, began a partial decommission of our legacy authentication middleware. The middleware they were decommissioning was a bridge layer. It connected the new systems to the old systems during the transition period. I sent a memo explaining that removing the bridge before the transition was complete was like pulling the scaffolding off a building that wasn't done yet. The memo was acknowledged. The decommission proceeded. The bridge came down. Some things broke. Mitchell's team patched the things that were obviously broken and moved on. Some things were not obviously broken. In October, a routine penetration test, which I had been running twice a year for 11 years, because that's what you do when you have 2.3 million patient records, flagged a vulnerability in the authentication pathway that the partial decommission had created. It was a specific class of vulnerability, the kind that doesn't crash anything and doesn't cause obvious errors and sits very quietly in your infrastructure like a very patient spider. The class of vulnerability is called a credential relay flaw, and what it means in plain language is that under specific conditions, an attacker who got a foothold anywhere in the network could escalate their privileges through a chain of trust relationships that should have been severed when the bridge layer was decommissioned. The pen test report said, in the very dry language that pen test reports use, Critical. Remediate within 30 days. I sent Mitchell a memo. I sent it to his direct report, the new VP of Infrastructure. I CC'd Dr. Vasquez because she had started quietly looping me into her own communications after she noticed that things were going wrong in ways that weren't appearing on any official dashboard. The memo was logged as reviewed in the ticketing system. Mitchell's team created a remediation ticket. The remediation ticket was assigned a priority level. The priority level was P2. P2 means important, but not urgent. The pen test report had said, critical. Remediate within 30 days. Mitchell's team set the P2 ticket's due date for the following quarter. I sent a follow-up memo in November. Same vulnerability, still unpatched. I escalated the language. I used the phrase material risk to protected health information. I used the phrase potential regulatory exposure. I used the phrase I am formally documenting my recommendation to halt non-essential infrastructure changes until this remediation is complete, which in the world of corporate liability documentation is approximately the equivalent of standing up in a meeting and yelling. The ticket was still P2. The due date was pushed to the following quarter. I sent the third memo in December, 2 weeks before they fired me. By this point, I had moved from recommending to imploring, which is a register I am not comfortable in and do not use lightly. I said, in writing, that the vulnerability was severe enough that in the event of a targeted attack, it could serve as the entry vector for a full system compromise, including the encryption key vault, including patient records. I said it clearly. I said it 3 times in different ways because I have 19 years of experience communicating technical risk to people who find technical risk abstract until it becomes concrete, and by then it's too late. The ticket was still P2. 2 weeks later, Mitchell called me into a conference room. There was an HR representative present, which is never a good sign. He told me my position was being eliminated. He said it with the kind of careful blankness that you get when someone has rehearsed their delivery and is focusing very hard on the delivery instead of the content. I asked if this was a layoff. He said it was a restructuring. I asked who would be taking over my responsibilities. He said the new infrastructure team was fully equipped to manage the transition. I asked specifically about the security handoff, the credential vault, the encryption key management, the incident response protocols, all of it. And he said they would handle it internally. I sent the handoff request that evening, formally, in writing. I requested 2 weeks to conduct a proper security knowledge transfer to whoever was taking over my responsibilities. I outlined what needed to be transferred. I listed, by name and by system, every piece of critical infrastructure that had a single point of knowledge failure, meaning me. I was very specific about the credential vault because the credential vault was the most critical piece. The vault held the encryption keys for the patient record database. Those keys were wrapped in a master key. The master key lived in a hardware security module. Think of it as a physical, tamper-evident box designed to do exactly one thing: protect cryptographic keys from unauthorized access. Access to the HSM required a credential that lived nowhere in the network. It lived in a physical token and in my memory. That was by design. That's best practice. That's what HIPAA's technical safeguards guidelines point toward when they say, access controls. You don't want the master key accessible to anyone who can get into the network, because the whole point is that a network breach shouldn't automatically become a data breach. I was the only person who knew how to get into that vault. Mitchell's reply to my handoff request arrived the next morning. It was 4 sentences. Sophie, thanks for this. We'll handle the transition internally. Your system's access is revoked effective 5 p.m. today. Best of luck. I read it 3 times. Then I screenshotted it. Then I sent it to Rachel Huang, my employment attorney, with the subject line, You're going to want to see this. I walked out of Harrow Health Systems at 5:03 p.m. on December 19th. It was raining. Portland rain. Not the honest kind. Just a persistent, non-committal drizzle. The kind of weather that feels like the atmosphere is also sort of giving up. I sat in my car for about 10 minutes. Not crying. Just thinking. Thinking about the credential vault and the P2 ticket and the unpatched vulnerability and the fact that there were 2.3 million people whose medical records were sitting behind a wall that only I knew how to maintain, and I had just handed over the keys to, well, I hadn't handed over anything. That was the problem. They hadn't let me hand over anything. I drove home. I filed the paperwork Rachel needed. I started updating my resume. The weeks between the firing and the 2 a.m. call were quieter than I expected. I spent the first few days in that strange suspended state that follows any major disruption, sleeping badly, eating fine, walking around my house at odd hours, touching things for no reason. My friend Dee came over and we drank wine, and she said, "Good riddance. You've been giving too much to that place for too long," which was kind and also beside the point. Rachel called me twice, once to discuss the severance agreement they'd sent over, and once to say, with great professional neutrality, that the agreement was interesting and that she had some thoughts. I told her to take her time. I started sleeping better by the end of the first week. I set up a consulting LLC. I had 3 conversations with former colleagues at other companies who had been trying to recruit me for years. I started reading books again. Actual books. Paper ones. The kind you read because you want to and not because you're trying to stay current on threat landscape developments. I was, if I'm honest, fine. I was more than fine. I was starting to think that maybe being fired was the best thing that had happened to me in a decade, which is a thought that I now understand was the universe setting me up. January 6th, 2:14 a.m. The phone rings. Dr. Vasquez. After she told me about her daughter, there was a silence that lasted long enough for me to understand its weight and short enough not to become unbearable. Then she said, "We have a ransomware attack. It started about 3 hours ago. It got into the patient record system. The encryption keys are locked." I set down my cereal bowl. Pseudo the cat looked at me. I looked at him. "Who discovered it?" I asked. "Our new VP of infrastructure. He called Mitchell at 11. Mitchell called the incident response firm at midnight. They've been working for 2 hours and they can't access the key vault. Did they try the recovery protocol I documented?" A pause. "Sophie, the documentation you left, the security runbook. It apparently wasn't part of the materials Mitchell's team received in the transition." I closed my eyes. The transition that didn't happen. Yes. So they have no documentation, no credentials, no way into the vault. "They have the vault's IP address," she said, and I could hear the exhaustion in her voice, and the particular kind of devastated precision that comes from someone who is very smart and has just understood exactly how badly they were let down by someone who was not. "The contractors team said the vault is encrypted. They said they've never seen this architecture. They said whoever built it—" She stopped. "They said it's very well designed, and they can't get in." "I know," I said. "I designed it." Another silence. Then, "Sophie, I need to ask you—" "Stop," I said, not unkindly. "Let me tell you how this is going to go. I'm going to call Rachel Huang. Rachel is going to call your legal team. And then we're going to have a conversation about the terms under which I might be able to help. Do you understand what I'm saying?" "Yes." No hesitation. "Yes, I do. What do you need from me?" "I need you to make sure Mitchell Park is on the call." Another pause. Longer. Then, "I'll make sure." I hung up. I sat there for a moment in my desk chair in my home office with the winter rain doing its half-hearted thing against the window, and Pseudo the cat still sitting on my networking textbook and the NAS drive blinking at me steadily. And I thought, there are 2.3 million people whose medical records are in that system right now. Some of them are kids with cancer. Some of them are elderly people whose medication lists are in that system, and whose pharmacies will be trying to pull those records tomorrow morning. Some of them are people who went to the emergency room in the last week, and whose triage data is sitting behind a vault that 4 different very competent incident response contractors cannot open because Mitchell Park fired the person who built it before she could tell anyone how it worked. I called Rachel. She answered on the second ring, which told me she'd been waiting for this call without knowing it was this call. "It's Sophie," I said. "Harrow Health just got hit with ransomware. The vault is locked. They called me." A brief silence. Then, "Of course they did." I could hear papers moving. "Tell me everything." I told her everything. She listened the way good lawyers listen, without interrupting, without reacting, just absorbing. When I finished, she said, "Okay, here's what we're going to do. First, I'm going to need you to be patient, because I know your instinct is to fix the problem, and I am telling you, as your attorney, and as someone who has been in rooms like this before, that the problem is not just the servers. The problem is the 19 years of work they discarded. The problem is the 3 memos they ignored. The problem is the documented negligence. We have them in the most legally exposed position I have seen in 14 years of employment law. And the only way to fix the servers and address the negligence is to address them together, in the same negotiation, tonight." "Rachel," I said, "there are kids with cancer in that system." "I know," she said. "That's why we're going to do this fast. Give me 20 minutes to draft the terms, then we call them." Those 20 minutes were the longest of my life, including the 20 I spent sitting in my car in the parking garage after they fired me. I refreshed my email 3 times. I walked to the kitchen and made coffee and drank half of it standing over the sink. I pulled up the original pen test report from October on my personal drive. I'd kept copies of everything, not because I knew I'd need them and not out of spite, but because 19 years in security teaches you that documentation is survival, and you practice it until it's reflex. I looked at the flagged vulnerability, CVE class, authentication relay, the specific mechanism by which a foothold in the perimeter network could cascade into privilege escalation. I had described it, in the 3rd memo, as a potential full-system compromise vector. I had been right. I had been right 14 months before it was necessary to be right, and being right hadn't been enough. Rachel called back at 2:41 a.m. "I have the terms. Listen carefully." The terms were full back pay for the period since my termination, a new contractor agreement for the work tonight, and any follow-on work at $450 an hour with a guaranteed minimum of 80 hours. A written acknowledgement from the company that my termination was directly linked to a failure to complete the security handoff protocol I had formally requested. A public statement from the organization, not buried in a press release, a real statement, acknowledging that deficiencies in the security handoff process had contributed to the incident. And Mitchell Park's resignation, effective within 30 days, to be submitted in writing to the board tonight. I listened to all of this. Then I said, "Rachel, the data has been potentially exposed for 3 hours. Every minute we negotiate is another minute the attackers have." "I know," she said. "That's their problem. They created it. How long will it take you to fix it once you have access?" I thought about it. The credential vault, unlocked. Maybe 20 minutes to get the encryption keys. Restoring system integrity from there if the ransomware had encrypted the databases themselves, and not just the key vault. That was more complex. I'd need to assess the damage scope. Best case, 4 hours. Worst case. I didn't let myself think about worst case. 4 hours, I said. Maybe less. Then every minute of negotiation they waste is a minute they chose to waste. Her voice was steady and clean. I'm going to call their legal team now. I need you to be ready to join a call in 30 minutes. Can you be ready? I'm already ready, I said. I was ready 3 weeks ago. The call connected at 3:09 a.m. Rachel and I were on one line. Harrow Health's general counsel, a man named Bryce who sounded like someone who had been asleep until 40 minutes ago and was very unhappy about that, was on another. Dr. Vasquez was on. Mitchell Park was on. And the quality of his silence was so specific and so dense that I could feel it through the phone. The silence of someone who has realized, somewhere between the 11th hour when the attack was discovered and the 3rd hour when the incident response contractors admitted defeat, that they had made a mistake so large and so structurally complete that it was now load-bearing. He had been the youngest CTO in Harrow Health's history. He'd been featured in a trade publication in September. The headline had been about modernizing legacy healthcare infrastructure. I had read it with the kind of feeling that I now understand was not professional jealousy, but grief. A specific grief for the thing I had built, being described by someone who didn't understand it, in terms that made it sound like a problem. Rachel presented the terms. She read them in a tone that was polite and completely without negotiating room, the way you read something to someone who is going to agree to it, and you're both just waiting for the part where they agree. Bryce started to say something about the legal framework of the existing employment agreement. Rachel said, with beautiful precision, I have 3 memos, spanning 14 months, in which Ms. Lang formally flagged a critical vulnerability that was directly exploited in tonight's attack. I have the ticketing system records showing that vulnerability was downgraded to P2 and never remediated. I have the email, dated December 19th, in which Ms. Lang formally requested a security handoff and was denied. Each of these documents was created in real time. Each one is timestamped and archived. I am happy to discuss the legal framework of the existing employment agreement, but I want to make sure we agree on what the context of that discussion is, which is that your organization has substantial exposure on multiple dimensions, including regulatory, civil, and potentially criminal negligence, and the fastest way to limit that exposure begins with Ms. Lang accessing that vault. Silence. The specific silence of a room where someone is doing math they don't like. Then Mitchell said, in a voice that was very carefully controlled in the way that voices are when the person using them is experiencing something large and trying not to. What are the terms exactly? Rachel repeated them, slower this time. Another silence. I heard Bryce say something off the line to someone I couldn't identify. I heard Dr. Vasquez's breathing, even and deliberate. I thought about her daughter's chart in the oncology system. I thought about the pen test report from October, and the word critical, and the 30-day remediation window, and the P2 ticket that was still P2 3 months later. Mitchell said, I'll agree to all of it. He said it quietly and without drama, and I think that was the worst part. Not defiance, not negotiation. Just a man who had run out of the thing that lets you pretend the consequences aren't yours. Rachel said, I need it in writing before Ms. Lang accesses any system. It took 11 minutes. A typed document, signatures via electronic authentication, sent to Rachel's inbox at 3:21 a.m. She read it. She said, Sophie. I'm here, I said. It's clean. I exhaled. Put on real pants. Grabbed my work bag, which I had never really unpacked, because some part of me had known. Put the hardware token in my pocket, the token that was the only physical key to the HSM, the key that Mitchell had been 4 sentences of email away from inheriting, and had chosen not to. I kissed the top of Pseudo's head. He looked unimpressed. I drove to the Harrow Health Data Center through Portland at 3:30 a.m. in the kind of silence that exists only in cities after 2 a.m., when even the people who are supposed to be awake are struggling. The roads were wet. The sky was that particular non-color that happens before dawn in the Pacific Northwest. Not dark and not light. Just a kind of gray suspension. I had been to this data center hundreds of times. I had been there at 3 a.m. before, not for ransomware, but for hardware failures, planned maintenance windows, the occasional server that decided to stop cooperating at the worst possible moment. The building was familiar to me the way places become familiar when you've spent real portions of your life inside them. The incident response contractor's lead was a man named Derek, who looked like someone who had not slept in about 30 hours and was running on the particular focused energy of a professional who has encountered a problem they cannot solve and is therefore experiencing a cognitive emergency. He looked at me when I walked in with the specific expression of a person who is experiencing simultaneous relief and humiliation. He had the grace not to pretend otherwise. "You built this," he said. "Yes," I said. "It's good work." "I know," I said. "That's why you called." I did not say this to be unkind. I said it because it was true and because I was tired, and because 19 years of good work had been dismissed as legacy debt. And this was just the factual consequence of that dismissal. And at 3:45 in the morning, there isn't a lot of room for softening. The damage scope was not as bad as it could have been, which is its own kind of horror, because not as bad as it could have been, in the context of 2.3 million patient records, is still very bad. The ransomware had used exactly the vulnerability I had flagged in October, the credential relay flaw, the authentication pathway that the bridge decommission had opened up. It had entered through the perimeter. It had escalated privileges through the trust chain. It had reached the patient record database and encrypted it. Then it had attempted to reach the key vault, because that's what modern ransomware does. It doesn't just encrypt your data, it tries to take your decryption keys too, because that's the double extortion model. Encrypt your files and threaten to publish them unless you pay. And it had hit the HSM and bounced. The vault had done exactly what I designed it to do. The attackers couldn't get in. The database was encrypted. The key to decrypt the database was locked behind a physical security mechanism that no amount of software exploitation could reach. The attackers didn't have the data. They had encrypted it. There was a difference, and the difference was the vault. And the vault had held because I had built it properly. "Okay," I said to Derek. "Here's what we're going to do. I'm going to access the HSM. I'm going to retrieve the wrapped encryption keys. Then I need to understand the exact scope of the database encryption. Which tables, which records, which backup states are intact." Derek nodded. He had his team quiet and ready, which told me he was good at his job even though tonight had not demonstrated that, because sometimes being good at your job means knowing when to step back and let someone else work. The HSM access was the kind of thing that looks anticlimactic when you describe it, and was not anticlimactic in any sensory detail of the experience. I inserted the physical token. I entered a credential sequence that existed only in my memory, not written down, not stored anywhere in any digital system, because the entire point of the HSM was that its access credentials could not be part of the network that was potentially compromised. I had always known this moment might come, in the abstract. The way you know a lot of things in the abstract when you spend enough time in security. The abstract had become concrete at 2:14 a.m. when my phone rang. The HSM authenticated. The vault opened. I extracted the wrapped keys. I moved through the restoration process the way I had designed the restoration process to be moved through. Step by step. with verification at each stage. Not because I was nervous, but because the protocol existed for a reason. And departing from protocol under pressure is how good nights become catastrophic nights. Derek's team followed along, quiet, taking notes. I could tell they were taking notes. I didn't mind. If they learned something tonight that made future systems safer, that was fine. That was what this was supposed to be. Database decryption took 45 minutes. The records came back clean. All 2.3 million. The backup integrity checks ran. The audit logs, which had continued logging throughout the attack, because I had architected the audit logging system to be independent of the main database. Another design choice that had been described in a meeting once as redundant infrastructure, showed me exactly what the ransomware had touched and what it hadn't. The oncology system was intact. Every record in it, every chemotherapy dosage record, every imaging result, every patient treatment note was exactly where it had been at 11:58 p.m. on January 5th. I thought about Dr. Vasquez's daughter. I finished the system integrity validation at 6:47 a.m. I wrote up a brief incident summary for Derek's team, enough to start their own formal report. I documented, in a separate note, the exact vulnerability that had been exploited, cross-reference to the 3 memos I had sent over 14 months, which I was going to send to Rachel in the morning for the regulatory filing that I assumed was coming, because when a HIPAA-covered entity experiences a breach that results from documented, unaddressed negligence, the Office for Civil Rights would like to know about that, and they have the authority to make knowing about it very expensive. Dr. Vasquez was waiting in the corridor outside the server room. She had been there, according to Derek, for most of the night. She looked like someone who had been awake for 6 hours making decisions about things she had very little power over, and was now standing very still in the way of people who have been very still inside for a long time. She looked at me when I came out. "Done?" she said. "Done," I said. "System's clean. Records are intact. All of them." She closed her eyes for a moment. Just a moment. Then opened them. "Sophie, don't," I said. Not harshly. Just... I didn't need it. I understood what she would have said. I understood why she hadn't fought for me in December when she probably could have. Because I understood how organizations worked, and I understood the specific cost of fighting battles that the people above you have already decided. I didn't need her to apologize for understanding the same thing. "The memos," she said. "Rachel has them. I know she does." She looked at me steadily. "I want you to know that I knew about the 3rd memo. Mitchell's team marked it reviewed without escalating it to me. I found out when the OCR is going to find out." "Okay," I said. I should have pushed harder earlier, before the 3rd memo. "Yes," I said. "You should have." We stood there in the corridor of the data center with the fluorescent lights doing what fluorescent lights do at 7 a.m., which is illuminate everything without flattering anything, and I was tired in a way that went deeper than sleep deprivation, a structural tiredness, and she looked the same way. "Is there anything else you need from me tonight?" I said. "No." She paused. "Thank you." "The invoice will come from Rachel's office," I said. I drove home. The drive home was quiet, in the way that things are quiet after the noise has stopped. Portland at 7 a.m. in January. The sky doing something tentative with light. The streets wet and empty. Everyone else still inside their warm houses making coffee and being normal in the specific way of people who did not spend the night in a server room retrieving encryption keys from a hardware security module. I drove through the neighborhood I had lived in for 12 years. Past the coffee shop that wasn't open yet. Past the park where the trees were bare and dripping. Past the elementary school where the lights were just starting to come on for the early staff. I pulled into my driveway, turned off the engine, and then I just sat there. I sat there because I was tired, yes, but not only that. I sat there because I was trying to understand what I was feeling, and it wasn't what I'd expected. It wasn't triumph. It wasn't relief exactly, though there was some of that. It wasn't even the cold satisfaction of having been demonstrably, irreversibly, undeniably right, though that was there too, in a way that I am not proud of but will not lie about. What I was feeling was something heavier than any of those things. I had been right. I had been right for 14 months, in writing, in formal memos, in escalating and increasingly alarming language, and being right had not been sufficient to prevent the thing I had been right about. The system had not self-corrected. The bad decision had not collapsed under the weight of its own badness. The P2 ticket had not risen to P1. The bridge had come down. The vulnerability had sat there, patient as the spider I'd compared it to, and eventually the spider had bitten. And 2.3 million people had spent 6 hours with their medical records at risk because one person had decided that healthcare IT was just servers with more forms, and another person, me, had chosen to document rather than fight. That was my fallibility. I knew it. I had known it since December 19th. I was good at building systems. I was good at understanding technical risk. I was not good at, what's the word? Confrontation. Not because I was afraid of Mitchell. I wasn't afraid of Mitchell. But because I had 19 years of experience watching institutional processes move slowly and believing each time that if you documented carefully enough and escalated correctly and followed the proper channels would deliver. Sometimes they did. Sometimes they didn't. This was a didn't. The contractor agreement I'd signed was going to be worth, after the guaranteed hours and the back pay and whatever additional work emerged from the regulatory process, somewhere in the range of a very good year. Rachel had sent me a message while I was driving that said, "The board accepted Mitchell's resignation at 5 a.m. They didn't push back." I had 3 companies who wanted to talk to me about full-time roles, and 2 more who had sent LinkedIn messages in the last 48 hours that I hadn't answered yet. My professional situation was fine. Better than fine. From any external angle, I had won. The patient records were intact. That mattered more than any of the professional circumstances, and I want to be very clear about that because I know how this story sounds, and I know that it sounds like a story about justice and comeuppance, and a competent woman being vindicated, and it was all of those things. But that is not why I sat in my driveway for 20 minutes. I sat there because some of those 2.3 million records belonged to children in oncology. Some of them belonged to people who were going into surgery that morning, whose medication allergies were in that database, whose blood type was in that database, whose entire medical history was in that database. And for approximately 3.5 hours, those records had been inaccessible and potentially exposed, and the only reason they were okay was because I had built the vault well enough that even a professional ransomware team couldn't crack it on a Tuesday night. It had worked. The thing I built had worked. And it should not have needed to work in that way. It should not have needed to be tested like that, under those conditions, against those stakes, with the architect of the system in her car at 3:30 a.m. driving to the data center because no one else could do it. That was a failure. Not my failure, or at least not only mine, but a failure of the system, the organizational system, the one made of incentives and hierarchies, and the specific human tendency to understand the value of something only in its absence. Competence isn't respected until it's absent, and by then respect costs $450 an hour. I thought about sending Mitchell a message. Not a cruel one, not a gloating one, just something. I thought about it for about 45 seconds and then let it go, because there was nothing I could say to Mitchell that the night hadn't already said more clearly. He had fired the only person who knew the root password. Then he had called her at 2 a.m., and she had answered. Not because of the money, not because of the vindication, not because she wanted to watch him resign. She had answered because of the kids with cancer and the medication lists and the 3 million people who had put their most private information into a system and trusted that someone was taking care of it. She had been taking care of it. That was the thing Mitchell had never understood. It wasn't about the title, or the influence, or the legacy infrastructure he'd called debt. It was about the 2.3 million people on the other side of the work. It was about the fact that healthcare IT, unlike the social media company he'd come from, was not a space where failures were bad PR and you issued an apology and did a rebrand. Healthcare IT was a space where failures had patient names attached to them, where a vulnerability sat in the authentication pathway like a spider, and you documented it, and flagged it, and begged, and the spider still bit because the person responsible for the spider decided it was a P2. It was light now, properly light. The kind of January morning that Portland occasionally produces as if to apologize for November, clear and pale and cold, the bare trees casting thin shadows across the wet driveway. My neighbor's car started. Someone, somewhere, was making coffee. The day was beginning in all the ordinary ways that days begin, unremarkably, for everyone who had slept through the night. I had not slept through the night. I sat in my car with the engine off and the heat fading, and Pseudo was inside waiting for his breakfast. And I was thinking about Dr. Vasquez standing in that corridor saying thank you, and about the moment the HSM authenticated and the vault opened, and about the very first system I had ever built at Harrow Health, a simple access control framework in the second year of my tenure that I had been so proud of at the time, and how that framework had evolved over 19 years into the thing that had just held tonight, and about all the hours and all the memos and all the meetings where I had explained, again, patiently, what a VPN was, and about the quiet way that Mitchell had said, "I'll agree to all of it," not defiant, not dramatic, just empty. The sound of a person who had finally encountered the distance between what they thought the work was and what the work actually was. The OCR investigation was going to take months. The regulatory process was going to be what it was going to be. The board was going to have to explain to its stakeholders how a critical vulnerability sat at P2 for 3 months. Rachel was going to be very busy. The 3 memos were going to be read by a lot of people who were going to wish they had been read by the right person in October. All of that was coming. All of that was correct. All of that was the consequence of documented negligence, meeting the regulatory framework that existed precisely because documented negligence in healthcare IT was something that had happened before and would happen again, and needed consequences to have the weight it deserved. But that was tomorrow. That was the next weeks and months, and the process, and the machinery. Right now it was 7:23 a.m., and I was in my driveway, and I was very tired, and the sun was doing something hesitant with the bare branches of the tree in my front yard, and I had just spent 4 hours in a server room recovering the medical records of 2.3 million people, including some children with cancer, and I had done it because I could, and because I built the thing, and because no one else could do it, and because I was, in the final accounting, after the sardonic detachment and the cold professional anger and the leveraged negotiation, I was still the person who cared about the 2.3 million people on the other side of the work. I had always been that person, even at 2 a.m. in a flannel robe eating cereal over a keyboard. Even when they stopped paying me to be that person. Even then. The tree in my front yard was not doing anything remarkable. The light was just light. Portland was just Portland. I sat with it. After a while, I went inside and fed the cat. He was unimpressed with the delay, which was fair. I made coffee and stood over it the way you stand over coffee when you are very tired, and you don't actually need the coffee. You just need something warm to hold. I thought, tomorrow I'll take a day, a whole day. No email, no consulting, no documentation, just a day. I thought, those records were intact. I thought, that was enough. I put the mug down and went to bed. Outside the window, the light was still doing something with the bare branches, something patient and gray and continuing. Somewhere across the city, in the oncology ward of a hospital whose systems I had just spent 4 hours restoring, a child with cancer was waking up to another morning. Their chart was accessible. Their records were intact. Their medication history was exactly where it was supposed to be, behind a vault that had held because someone had built it to hold, and had spent 19 years making sure it held, and had answered the phone at 2 a.m. because it needed to keep holding, and she was the only person who knew how. She hadn't done it for the money. She had done it because those were real people, and she couldn't let Mitchell's ego kill them twice. Pseudo the cat was fed at 7:31 a.m. and found the whole thing completely beneath his notice, which, honestly, same.